Okay, away we go. Peter, thanks for the invitation. And second time I believe I've been with the group, and it's always good to be with you. I love following your newsletter, and you guys do a great job. Thank you for this. The topic today is going to be the Babe's Greatest Impact. Sorry, I didn't upgrade that. But it's from my latest book, Baseball at the Abyss, The Scandals of 1926, Babe Ruth, and the Unlikely Savior Who Rescued a Tarnished Game. And it takes us back to the winter following the 1926 season, leading into the 1927 season. And at that time, baseball was really in tatters. It was really in a troubled state, and it was made so by a very big scandal that had broken out. And it got huge headlines in just about every paper in the country for several weeks. And many sports writers at the time said that they felt this was potentially a worse scandal than the Black Sox scandal of 1919 and then the court trial in 21. And one of the reasons that they felt this was worse was that it involved two of the biggest names in the game, Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker. And it involved a pair of men who were in Cobb and Speaker who were not just players, but were player managers. And it focused on their actions in allegedly fixing a game or more and betting on a game or more that were fixed. And the origins of the scandal traced to a former player of Cobb's by the name of Dutch Leonard. Leonard had been an outstanding pitcher with the Red Sox in the teens, finished his career in Detroit under Cobb, and had become injured in the 25 season, and his career ended then. And he'd come to Central California. His farm's about 10 miles from my home. I've visited the farm. It's still owned by a family member. And Leonard was a very prolific farmer, very wealthy farmer. In fact, many of the sports writers of that era suggested that with Cobb being the wealthiest player in the game, through his investments in things like GM and Coca-Cola and others, Leonard was probably the second wealthiest player in the game due to his very prolific farming operation here in California. And the way this scandal came about, Dutch Leonard had in his possession some letters. And they were letters that were sent to him by Ty Cobb and Smokey Joe Wood, who at that time was with Cleveland playing for Tris Speaker. And they alluded to some bets on games. In the case of Smokey Joe Wood, he was sending Leonard a check. We won the $420. I gave West $30, leaving $390 or $130 for each of us. West was an employee of the ballpark in Detroit, who Cobb allegedly used to go out and place bets on his behalf. Wood went on in his letter to Leonard, if we ever have another chance like this, we will know enough to get down early. The men had all suggested that they didn't get as good of odds as they had hoped for because they waited a little bit too long to get their money down on a particular game in September of 1919. These letters, they dealt with a game in 1919, and the thrust of it was that the Tigers were battling for third place. The pennant was sewn up already by the White Sox. Second place, Cleveland had it pretty much nailed down, and the Yankees and Tigers were fighting for third. And Cobb and Leonard happened to run into Speaker and Wood under the stands one afternoon. And Cobb is alleged to have said, we really need to get third place. We really want this third place money. Speaker, according to those who witnessed it and overheard, said, don't worry, we'll see. I'll see to it you win tomorrow if I have to pitch myself. Well, he didn't pitch himself, but he certainly saw to it, according to sports writers who thought that the outcome was a little suspicious. Detroit won in a very lopsided way, and sports writers questioned Speaker leaving his starting pitcher in through this entire ball game. Speaker's answer to them was, we wanted to catch the last train to Cleveland and not have to take a boat at night on the lake. But still, there were some suspicions about the game. Dutch Leonard had had these letters in his possession for 7 years. He had never intended to do anything with them at all. He had a conversation with a friend and former teammate, Harry Heilman, in which he let slip that he had these letters and what the letters alluded to. Well, Heilman became upset. Heilman was not a fan of Ty Cobb, as Frank Navin, through this investigation, found few of his players really liked playing for Cobb. And Heilman challenged Leonard and said that Heilman said he had an appointment the next day with Frank Navin, who owned the Tigers, and that if Dutch Leonard had not made Navin aware of these letters, that Harry Heilman said he would do it himself. And Dutch Leonard felt he was in a difficult place. He didn't want to turn these letters over. And his wife, Muriel, she was a former showgirl in vaudeville, and they had a number of show business friends who loved to come and attend barbecues and swim at their farm. And Muriel Leonard was very concerned that this was going to hurt their standing in baseball, hurt them with their friends, and really hurt their reputation if they turned these letters over. And Leonard stewed about it, and ultimately he did send the letters. He turned the letters over to Frank Navin, who got them to this man, Ban Johnson, the president of the American League. And Johnson turned some investigators loose. And when they reported back to him, he summoned Cobb and Speaker from an off-season hunting trip in November. They were in Wyoming. And he summoned them to immediately come to his office in Chicago. And there he told both that they were banned from the American League forever. They would never play or manage in his league again. He said while he could not prove that they fixed a game or games, the letters showed it was irrefutable that they had gambled as managers on a game they were involved in, and there was no place for that. And with the ban, though, he told both men he respected their reputations, didn't want to hurt their families, and that this matter, their banishment, would remain confidential, and he would give them the opportunity to say whatever they wanted in terms of their decision to leave the game. So within about 48 hours, Cobb announced his resignation as manager of the Tigers. He said he quit because the club wasn't going to be a winning ball club and didn't want to manage them anymore. Speaker was a little more vague. It was a couple more days after that he finally announced his resignation. And, reading some of the articles and columns tied to his announcement, you get a sense that sports writers really didn't buy what was going on with him. And they had a second place club the year before in 26. And there was a lot of excitement in Cleveland over the ball club. And so the sports writer really didn't buy his explanation. As far as staying in confidence, well, that didn't last very long. The Chicago Tribune got wind of it. They went with the story. The New York Daily News, which at the time was the most widely read newspaper in America, they got it. Banner headlines ensued. And many of the sports writers in their columns and articles took the side of Cobb, who, screamed his innocence. But one man who didn't was the legendary Damon Runyon, who wrote, "A man with a clear conscience does not commonly accept charges reflecting on his honor." The scandal grew, though. A sports writer happened to be in Minnesota to go to the Mayo Clinic. And he happened to go into a pool hall one night where he ran into Swede Risberg, the former shortstop, one of the 8 banned Black Sox, former Chicago White Sox shortstop, and the ringleader of that whole 1919 World Series scandal. And he asked Risberg, the sports writer asked Risberg what he thought about these claims about Cobb and Speaker. And Risberg said, "No, that's nothing. I got a lot more on fixed games, and some of it involves Cobb." Well, when that got out, that brought the commissioner into the matter. And Commissioner Landis by this time felt that Ban Johnson, who had said that he forwarded everything to Landis, Landis believed that Johnson really hadn't. And Landis put his own investigators on the matter. And then in early January of 27, Landis held 2 days of hearings. And at the end of it, sports writers were a little stunned because, as they pointed out, it all just focused on Swede Risberg's accusations, and none of it dealt with Ty, Tris, Dutch Leonard. And so their columns, while reporting the testimony in the hearings, came out of it asking, wait a minute, where is all of this on the matter that started the whole thing? And Landis gave him a deadline when he would make a decision. Well, actually, what Landis was trying to do, he was trying to get Dutch Leonard to come to Chicago to testify. And the attorneys for both Cobb and Speaker had demanded that their clients have the opportunity to face their accuser. And as there are a number of legal reviews, judicial reviews that have done stories about Judge Landis and his actions, and they all have the same conclusion that Landis really followed proper judicial principles in any investigation that his office conducted. And when he was not able to produce Dutch Leonard for a hearing with them, and Leonard, he was exasperated. He had tried every which way possible to get Leonard to Chicago. And Leonard's response was, as you see on the screen, he wouldn't come. And he said the reason was they bumped people off there. He had been threatened. Cobb had really vilified him in the press and spread a lot of falsehoods about him and his motivation in the press. And Leonard just wanted no part of it anymore and would not come to Chicago. So that left Landis with no choice but to reinstate Cobb and Speaker. Connie Mack pounced at the opportunity, and he signed Cobb, who played his last 2 years with Mack's ball club in Philadelphia. Tris Speaker joined the first club that reached out to him, the Washington Senators, played for them for a year, and then went to Philadelphia after that. So the matter, as soon as that was dealt with, another scandal erupted. And this one involved the best player in the National League, Rogers Hornsby. A Kentucky bookmaker made public that Hornsby owed him $92,000 in unpaid gambling debts. And it turned out that this had been a problem that had been festering. The owner of the Cardinals had ordered Hornsby to disassociate from the man. Hornsby had invited the man as his guest to spend spring training with the Cardinals. And on Saturday games in St. Louis, the man would come from Kentucky, and Hornsby would give him access to the clubhouse and the dugout. And the owner of the Cardinals, when he found out who the guy was, he was all over Hornsby to disassociate from him, and Hornsby wouldn't do it. And that was a key factor in the decision by the Cardinals, even though they had won the World Series in 1926, and Hornsby was a huge star in St. Louis because of his actions as a player manager and producing that championship. They traded him to the New York Giants. And what was interesting was Hornsby, that just created an additional hornet's nest, because Hornsby owned 10% of the Cardinals. And of course, the rule that both the National League and American League followed was that no one who owned a stake in one team could be involved in ownership of another team. And this went right down to the opening day, the evening before opening day, before Hornsby agreed to sell his shares. He was trying to get a higher price than the valuation of them. But it was a big mess. And it turned out that fans in St. Louis after the World Series had gifted Hornsby a car, and he turned around and gave the keys to it to another bookmaker who he owed money to. He owed money to 3 or 4 bookies in and around St. Louis and Kentucky. So it was a huge problem, but they went to Landis with it, and Landis, he was convinced that Hornsby's gambling did not involve baseball, so he did not take any action. The Kentucky bookie wanted Landis to garnish Hornsby's wages, and he said, it's a personal matter. You've got to take it to court. It's not something that baseball can deal with. And but this just added to the black eye that baseball was given following the 26 and before the start of the 27 season, which brings us to Babe Ruth. And to me, this was a very appropriate picture for the time. This picture was taken in January of 1927 in Los Angeles. Babe had arrived. He was on a vaudeville tour, and he was greeted by this group of young actresses who were part of a public relations group that the movie studios used. They were called the Wampus Babies. And I say it's appropriate because at this time in Babe Ruth's life, his life was a train wreck. And chasing women was one part of the reason. Of course, he had separated from his wife. There was a huge financial payout to her of $100,000 and title to the farm. Ruth was really in serious financial trouble at this time in his life. He spent lavishly. He owned 9 of the most expensive luxury cars made at that time. Spent lavishly on clothes. He thought nothing of, while on the road, leaving custom-made shirts. I believe in St. Louis once, he left 44 of them in the hotel closet when the team left to go to the next city. And he also was a heavy loser at the track. He relied on a lot of fans' tips, which were never good and never successful. His gambling at the tracks generally happened in the off season. The dog tracks he would go to in Florida. But at this, because of his financial problems, enter Christy Walsh. And you've probably all heard of Christy Walsh. He's kind of regarded as the first agent in sports history, but he connected with Ruth in 1921 on an idea that he had to have Ruth ghostwrite newspaper columns that became very successful for both Walsh and Ruth, financially and professionally for Walsh. But at that time, Ruth was really going through a tough time, both as a player and off the field as well. His productivity was declining. The home runs were slipping. 25 had been a disastrous season for him, both in terms of his health and his productivity. Of course, you remember they called it the bellyache heard round the world. Got off the train when the Dodgers arrived, or the Yankees arrived in Asheville, North Carolina for an exhibition game, and collapsed on the platform. The Yankees immediately put him on a train for New York. He collapsed on the train as it was coming into New York. And initially the doctors, both in North Carolina and in New York, just chalked it up to Babe overeating and it being a bellyache. And the more they got into it and the more they checked, it was something far more serious. And he underwent surgery and missed the first 2 months of the 1925 season. But sports writers really went after him. They had a go at him and really ripped him as a glutton, and that was a big problem for Ruth. A lot of his teammates were aghast at his eating habits, and they really had a go at him with their headlines like these that appeared when he had the surgery and was in the hospital. But Walsh felt that this was a real critical time. He had been talking to Ruth about investing. Ruth he had no interest in investing. He didn't believe in it and really ignored the advice that came from Walsh. Walsh tried constantly to tell him about players who had gone broke within a year or two of leaving the game. And he warned Ruth that he was on that same path. So he felt this was a critical off season for Ruth, to try and rebuild his finances, which he did with a couple of deals. The first, he got him a deal starring in his own vaudeville show. And he struck an exclusive deal with the Pantages Theaters chain. Ruth got about $65,000. He cut it short, but he got about $65,000 for doing this. And then the other was a movie. Babe Comes Home was a silent picture. And with incentives, Ruth was in position to make $100,000 doing this movie. And ultimately, Walsh did convince Ruth to invest his non-baseball salary. And Ruth, once he became sold on this, it led him to be very wealthy when he finished his playing career. But with the movie deal came a caveat from Christy Walsh. He told Ruth that if he was going to go to Hollywood to make this movie, which he was going to be there for about 6 weeks, he had to hire a fitness trainer. And he had to follow everything he said. So Ruth hired a guy by the name of Artie McGovern. Now, Ruth had used him to kind of rehab from his surgery in 1925. So there was a familiarity. And a lot of people, Jack Dempsey, the fighter, used Artie McGovern. And a number of Wall Street executives went to Artie McGovern. He was an interesting guy. Talk a lot about him in the book and how he was self-taught, former boxer, and became very, very successful, both as kind of an early day physical therapist and a personal trainer. But the feeling was with Ruth in LA, he was away from a lot of his vices and distractions on the East Coast. And Artie McGovern could have some success with him, and he did. McGovern had him working out daily. They shot the baseball scenes to the movie at the minor league Wrigley Field where the Los Angeles Angels played. And between takes, McGovern would have him, he had weight equipment and medicine balls and things like that, and had Ruth doing some weight exercises. And the other thing that Artie McGovern sized up about Babe Ruth really quickly was that he was a hugely competitive guy. And so sticking him on a stationary bike wasn't going to work. He'd get bored quickly and he wouldn't want to continue with that kind of a workout routine. But Ruth loved to box and he loved to play handball. And so between takes, he'd set him up with some of the extras, as you can see here in the picture, and he'd box. They had a setup at the studio when they were shooting scenes at the studio. They had some weights and things where Ruth could do training. Two other things that were had a huge impact. Artie McGovern had Babe Ruth first thing every morning, get up and run 5 miles. This was very thoroughly documented in newspapers in Los Angeles. It was so consistent that there were certain streets and intersections where people would gather in the morning to watch him and applaud him as he ran by. And he really got on Ruth about his eating, and he laid out a whole eating program, a nutrition program that didn't involve just telling him what to eat, but teaching him why and what was important. And Ruth wrote newspaper columns. Some of his syndicated newspaper columns really became advice columns for people. And the end result was amazing. Ruth finished the 1926 season weighing 254 pounds. When he reported to spring training for the 1927 season, he weighed 218. When he arrived in St. Petersburg for spring training, he went straight to the golf course and got in a round with 2 sports writers who were stunned at how much farther he was hitting the ball off the tee. The next day, when he checked into the Yankees training camp and took his first batting practice, teammates were really amazed at how much farther they felt the ball was carrying off his bat. When he got into the locker room, the uniform that was set up for Babe was based on his previous season's weight and measurements. And so when he went to put the pants on, they just fell to the floor. And everybody got a big laugh out of that. When he started his first batting practice round, there was actually a farmer working in a field well beyond the right field fence. And a baseball landed just a few inches from him. And a few minutes later, a bat boy came running out into the field after the ball, and the farmer picked it up and said, "I guess Babe's here today, huh?" And so what was the end result of this new Babe Ruth? Well, quickly before I get to that, if you want to see what Babe Ruth looked like, because all the images that are generally public are of him as a heavy person. But there's a film that was shot in July of the 1927 season. It's a Harold Lloyd comedy called Speedy. It is on YouTube. Now, I was at the Hall of Fame 3 weeks ago, and they do have it on display there in their Babe Ruth exhibit. And Ruth has a cameo in the film, and it is striking how trim he is. This is not the Babe Ruth that much of America pictures, but it is a product of the training that he had done. So the end result of all that, of course, was Babe's greatest season, 60 home run year. And the new home run record, his chase was the talk of the season, probably from May on. It was the big headline grabber. And it saved the game. W.O. McGeehan, the sports editor of the Pittsburgh Press, wrote, "The interest returned to the national pastime. Instead of losing customers, it gained customers and new ones. They were coming to see Babe Ruth." So the stain of the scandal and the loss many felt fans would have of credibility toward the results of the game were all wiped away by the season that Babe Ruth had, which was a result of his work. And there's some really interesting tangible evidence of Ruth's season. Back then, of course, there was not Bill Veeck yet. There was not the Chicken or any of the other Al Shatt or any of the other great attractions. And it was really up to being in the pennant race as to how well your club drew at the box office. So in 1927, the Senators, the Browns, the White Sox, and Cleveland saw their attendance drop. Cleveland's the most dramatic, by almost 45% over 1926. But the impact of Ruth, and also, Gehrig had a great run that year, challenging Ruth for a few months, and it was a hugely publicized home run duel. You see, Cleveland, for their significant drop in attendance, still almost 30% of what they did draw came from their 12 home dates with the Yankees. The A's, they were in the pennant race for a time. They had a good club. They finished second. Over 30% of their home attendance came from their 12 games with the Yankees. The Browns, perennial poor draw, but still 40% of their home attendance came from those games with the Yankees. And the Boston Red Sox, 46% of their home attendance came from their 12 games with Ruth and the Yankees. What is also amazing, and I think it shows the benefit of his training, Ruth hit 17 of those 60 home runs in the last 26 games of the season. Technically hit 17 in 25 because he didn't homer in the last game of the year. And what's remarkable about that is you might even see quotes. I mean, out here on the West Coast, we're reading Giants players saying, the young players talking about how worn down they are and they've never felt this kind of fatigue. That's common. because the grind of baseball hits you in September. And that's when a lot of players taper off out of fatigue. But Ruth had his biggest month in September, hitting 17 home runs, which is a testament to how much better fit he was. The Sporting News after the World Series had a big spread all about Ruth and his preseason training. And they wrote, Ruth became the first baseball player in history to employ a personal physical trainer. Babe Ruth should go down in history as having provided the most constructive contribution to baseball that the game has known. And indeed, it took a lot of years before baseball fully embraced it. But now you see weight rooms, strength and conditioning coaches, they are a staple of the game today. And I know many of the strength coaches in Major League Baseball, and over the past several months in talking with them, I've posed that question, who's the father of strength and conditioning? Who was the player that got it all started? And I can tell you, none of them guessed Babe Ruth. So thanks for letting me share that. And I'm certainly open to questions, conversation, and anything you'd like to do.
Was there ever any allegation throughout the whole history of Babe Ruth's life that he could have been involved in any kind of gambling?
That was asked during this time, during the investigation. And that question was put to Ban Johnson and Landis if they had ever turned up anything on Ruth. Landis was adamant, no, that he never. And Ban Johnson had detectives who would sit next to or around dugouts because they wanted to eavesdrop. And for example, they talked about when this first came up, Ban Johnson told a magazine, Collier's magazine in Chicago, that all the Cleveland Ball Club ever did was talk about horse racing. They never talked baseball in the dugout. But no, Landis and Johnson were both very adamant that they never had any, Babe had his problems. Don't get me wrong. I mean, Babe was spending $20,000 a year on private investigators of his own because he was being blackmailed so often by women publicly stating he was the father of their child. But it would turn out that they were fronts for actual blackmail groups that were targeting him. And he beat every one because he spent this kind of money on investigators. But that was really the only type of scandalous thing that turned up in many articles about Ruth. But Landis and Johnson said, absolutely no, there was never a hint, never a trace of any gambling related scandal with Babe Ruth.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody else. Wow.
Guys are quiet tonight.
Yeah. Is it the weather on the East Coast?
It's
Well, I might as well
interesting
just
that,
throw in, I think I probably know the answer to this, but I suppose then no other Yankees were ever implicated or investigated seriously.
On this matter, not to my knowledge. On other matters, I really didn't pursue those other players. So that's a good, there certainly was the Jake Powers incident in 1938, much later. That was not a gambling related thing, but in terms of gambling.
Yeah, I was really just referring to the Ruth era.
Yeah, no, not that I came across.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
a question. When Cobb and Speaker came back to, I think you said the Nationals and the Athletics, did either of them manage again?
No, they did not. They did not. It was interesting because when Landis put them back, removed them from the restricted list, Frank Navin, the owner of the Tigers, said he wanted no part of Ty Cobb ever again. And the owner of the ball club in Cleveland said that he just felt it would be inappropriate for Speaker to come back. But no, neither of them managed again, Tom.
Yeah, I didn't know if obviously Landis overruled Ban Johnson essentially, right? Which I guess he had authority to do as the commissioner. But it seems like a bit of a slap in the face. But I didn't know if there was any agreement there that they could be reinstated but not manage.
Well, what was interesting too is there was a lot of animosity between Ban Johnson and Landis. I think that Ban Johnson certainly was upset that he wasn't made the commissioner, or at least he wanted that kind of authority. He did a lot behind Landis's back. And in this case, there were some things leaked to I'm not so sure that the Chicago Tribune didn't get their information from Van Johnson in an attempt to embarrass Landis. Because Landis, once it all broke right around Christmas of 1926, or I think it was Thanksgiving of 26, Landis indicated that he felt Johnson did not send everything over to him. He had not seen the letters. He did not know anything about the letters, because he did get on a train and travel to Central California to Dutch Leonard's farm, because Leonard kept copies and he wanted to see those copies. He wanted to talk face to face with Dutch Leonard. And it was very clear. And of course, Landis said it, that Johnson did not forward everything to him, even though he publicly said he did.
Right. It seems, just from hearing the story, that Van Johnson was president before there was a commissioner, and he ran the league.
Created it.
Yes. And so he had the authority to do that. Now, obviously, after the 19 scandal, it was pretty obvious that Landis was running Major League Baseball.
Right.
And so it seems a bit out of place for Johnson to go and do his investigation and say, I'm taking these guys out of my league, as if he could do that. And then so then if the National League takes him, who cares? But it seems like he's acting as if he was still pre-1919. Is that
the two leagues really operated like they were Coke and Pepsi. I mean, they really operated like totally separate business entities. For instance, when Johnson, word got out that Johnson had suspended Cobb and Speaker, John McGraw, the Giants were looking for a box office attraction to rival the pull that Ruth had with the Yankees across the river. And McGraw reached out to Landis and said, I want to sign Ty Cobb. If he's banned from the American League, I can take him. And that's when Landis was kind of getting the idea that there was more here. And he told McGraw, no, hold off. So, yeah, it's interesting how the two leagues operated, as completely separate entities. Johnson, could take action against his people. And one thing that was really interesting was Johnson was always upset because many of the allegations that Sweet Risberg and others made about other fixed games always seemed to involve American League teams. And that really upset Van Johnson, because he tried to claim that there were National League teams that were involved in game fixing. He was always raising the issue of the New York Giants fixing the 1917 World Series and demanding that be investigated. And Landis ultimately said that he had thoroughly investigated it and it was untrue. So you got a sense that here was a guy who was very protective of his own league. He was a guy who was autocratic. He was going to deal with his people his way. And if he could do something to maybe embarrass Landis and give the appearance that Landis really wasn't totally in control, you kind of got the sense he was going to do it. That's the way I came away from the research into that.
Once these letters that Dutch Leonard had were obtained, what became of Dutch Leonard and his future?
Well, interesting. I could tell you some fun stories because, I'm on our selection committee here in Fresno, California for our Sports Hall of Fame. Dutch is in it. But I never knew a lot about him until I stumbled onto this. And there's a street about 10 miles east of my house, Leonard Avenue, which I have passed thousands of times and never had any idea. Frank Chance and Tom Seaver are from Fresno. The 41 freeway, obviously 41, is named, a section of it near the ballpark is named for Tom Seaver. The street that our county fairgrounds is on is Chance Avenue. But I never had any idea that Leonard Avenue out in the country east of Fresno began in the teens as the road onto Dutch Leonard's farm. And later he deeded land to the county to make the road extend for several miles, and it became Leonard Avenue and is still there today. Dutch Leonard, when he was with the Red Sox, he was one of their top pitchers on that staff with Smokey Joe Wood, Carl Mays, Babe Ruth, when they won the World Series 3 times. And his banker here in Fresno, when he would come home, would urge him to take his World Series money and invest it. And he recommended investing it in land. Well, Leonard ultimately owned over 2,000 acres at a massive farm. And it was, one of the biggest grape growers in America. And he had a packing operation. He had a cold storage facility. He had a shipping company, very wealthy, very prolific. About a year and a half ago, I had a friend who's since passed, very involved in sports. And we were chatting one day and he asked me, what I was working on. And I told him about this project. He said, I was on that farm when I was a kid. Wow, at last, somebody who had been on the farm and had met Dutch Leonard. And I asked him about it, and he said, "Oh, Dutch was really, it was very interesting. I was a young kid, but it was really interesting." And he called me the next day. Oh, and he said the thing I always remember was he had this enormous swimming pool. And now I remember finding the Boston Globe sent a reporter out to do a story about Dutch's farm, and they talked about all these celebrities and ball players coming here in the off season to hang out, swim in his pool, enjoy his barbecues. And so this guy said, he had this huge pool. And I said, "Bill, how big was the pool?" And he said, "It was so big, it had a submarine in it." A submarine? What? So the next day he calls me and he gives me a name and number of a lifelong friend of his whose dad was the foreman on Dutch Leonard's farm. And the family had lived for 10, 11 years on the farm. So I contacted the guy and we had a nice chat. And I said, "Now, Bill told me he had this enormous pool." And the guy said, "Oh, I'm looking out my patio door at my pool, and I don't think it's any bigger than my pool." And I'm trying to jog his memory. And I said, "Well, Bill said it was so big it had a submarine." He said, "A submarine? It was a pool sweep." So, but the guy said, I said, in Dutch's obituary, his nephew said that he would never talk baseball. And that the family members were disappointed that they never learned about these guys he played with and against and the era that he played. And this guy said, "Well, that's a crock." Because he said, we used to sit up, he loved to party. He loved to have big barbecues and have people come to the farm. And he loved to sit up till late at night and tell stories about Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb and all these guys that he played with. Oh my gosh, that would have been amazing. He died in about 1970, had a massive stroke. But yeah, he was very influential in farming. He was on boards for raisins and table grape associations, very influential. And he taught himself golf and became quite a champion, a multi-time City of Fresno champion, and a terrific amateur golfer up and down the state of California.
Did he develop that farm himself, or
Yes.
did he inherit it in any way? It was
Not at all.
He developed it himself.
World Series money. He came from a very musical family. His parents were musicians. He had a brother who wrote what's still the fight song that Fresno State uses in their sports programs. So it was a very musical family. They were not an agriculture family at all. They were here in the city of Fresno proper. So it was a real change for him to go out and take up farming. And ultimately, a couple of his brothers became involved in the farm with him. But in terms of around here, now his wife later divorced him. I don't know if the scandal played any part of that. I've never, in all the things I've read and people I've talked to, I've never gotten that sense. But I don't sense that the scandal hurt him. It did at the time. The Pacific Coast League said if he ever wanted to come back, they didn't want him coming back with any of their teams. Silly stuff like that. But no, he never came back to play professional baseball.
Yeah, I was just confirming that he's the one that holds the single season ERA record still.
Second.
Oh, who beat him?
I think he was it 097? Was that what it was?
096 is his.
096. I thought somebody just prior to him had one just slightly lower. I could be wrong.
Okay, but I noticed on the page it says he died in 1952.
Was it 52? I could be mixing it. I've been working on another book, and I might have that person confused with him.
What's him? Because they keep mentioning Fresno on there, Fresno High School and everything. So that is him.
High School of Tom Seaver, Frank Chance, Bobby Jones, who pitched for the Mets. Yeah, it's a school with a great baseball background. Yeah. But yeah, he's pitched 2 no-hitters. His winningest season, well, he won 18 a particular season, and he was clowning around with teammates in the clubhouse and broke a bone in his hand. Missed the last 6 weeks of the season, or he probably would have been a 20-game winner that year.
Well, he won 19 in the year he had the 0.96 ERA.
Yeah. He was one of the best left-handers in the American League. Not a hard thrower. He was a guy that mixed it up and changed speeds, changed locations. But yeah, he was very interesting. It was interesting to learn more and more about him. This fellow gave me directions on how to find the farm, because my wife and I occasionally would go out in that area and hit produce stands and get some farm fresh produce. And so we wanted to find the farm. And one particular day, after I had spoken to the guy on the phone, my wife was leaving. She's a teacher. She was leaving early in the morning. And she said, "What are you going to do today?" And I said, "I think I'm going to go find Dutch Leonard's farm." And she said, No. I want to go with you. I want to see this place." So a couple of days later, we took a ride out that way, going down Chance Avenue. And they told me a landmark or two to look for. And I found them and went down almost a quarter of a mile. You go down this long road, and it bends, and you see the farmhand's house and the staff, the house for the staff that worked in the house, and then you see the mansion. And I pulled around to the east side to get out and get some pictures. And my wife said there were no trespassing signs everywhere, which I ignored. And I get out and I climb up on this little berm, and the swimming pool's right below. I mean, it's a stone-lined pool, and the platform is there, and it's very impressive. I mean, it clearly hasn't had water in it for years, because there were a couple of large trees that had grown in the deep end. But my wife hollers at me not to go too far away from the car. And I said, "Why?" He says, "Because if anybody comes out shooting, I don't know how far I can drag your body."
Oh my gosh.
But it was interesting to find it, and to know that it's still in the family. And I did a talk to the Rotary Club there. The town it's closest to, and the mailing address is a town called Sanger. And I did a talk to the Rotary Club, and it was really kind of fun to, with the PowerPoint, put up the Leonard Avenue sign and on my PowerPoint, and see everybody's chins hit the floor. Even the head of the Chamber of Commerce and people in the city really did not know the story of Leonard Avenue or the story of Dutch Leonard, although there were a couple of guys who knew his nephew, who they said had recently retired as a dentist in the town.
You didn't see an old submarine in that swimming pool, did you?
Well, what's funny about that is my friend Bill passed away not long after. And I told that story at his memorial. And afterwards, the guy came up. His friend who had lived on the farm came up with his wife and chatted with my wife and I. And he kind of nudged me and he goes, "I got all my friends with that story." I guess that was a common trick he pulled on his friends, to tell them that the pool sweep was a submarine.
Tim Keefe is the #1 ERA.
And what's the
0.86.
Wow. Pretty amazing.
1880.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's an amazing season that Dutch had. I don't think we'll ever see that.
But Keefe only had 105 innings that year. And
Okay.
Leonard had 224 in his.
Yeah.
I think Leonard holds the modern mark after 1900.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. That's great. And that's one of the issues that, Leonard, one of the problems that was a big rub between Leonard and Cobb, because Cobb really went to great lengths to get him to Detroit. And he never felt like he had good enough pitching to win in Detroit. And, the Red Sox, as you probably know, when they had a big star and the star started asking for more money, well, they got rid of him. I mean, it's unbelievable, all the people that they had through the years that they got rid of, including Ruth, and Leonard was one of them. And so he was traded and ended up in Detroit, and Cobb was the one that really pushed Navin to get him. And then there was a stretch where Leonard held out, and sports writers warned Navin, you're not going to break him like you do the average player. He doesn't need baseball money. And ultimately, the Tigers Cobb felt they were in the hunt and had a chance to win, and he really called Dutch and pleaded with him to come back, and Dutch, he wanted, I don't know if it was 4 or 5 days rest between starts, because he knew the way Cobb was in wearing down pitchers. He would get somebody going good and he would just overuse them. Gee, where have we heard that? Philadelphia, maybe? Anyway, and so Cobb made that promise and quickly broke it. And Leonard was struggling. He was really having some shoulder problems. and got into it with Cobb in the clubhouse, and Cobb didn't like being called out in front of the players, and so they had some real problems, and that was one of the things, Cobb went around saying that this was just a vendetta. When the scandal broke and the letters were turned over, Cobb said that Leonard had a vendetta, and that's why he was doing this. And even Landis said in his conversation with Leonard, it was clear that Leonard did harbor a grudge. Then Cobb tried to say that Leonard was doing it for money. The New York Daily News had an article saying that Leonard's farm was in trouble, and that's why he did this, to get money. And I went and did some research on what the price of grapes, what grapes fetched that year, based on his acreage, what his yield should have been, and even in a bad year, minimum yield, what it should have been. And he would have made low six figures on a bad year, and he would have made seven figures revenue on a good year. And of course, he had household staff, farm staff to pay, but still, he would have made a lot of money. And I have a hard time buying the idea that he did it for money.
It's interesting to think of 1927 and Ruth. You think of that resurrection of his career and the big year he had, but to think of it in terms of maybe yet again, maybe not saving baseball, but distracting people like he did in 1920 with his huge season then after night. It's and plus this whole thing dated back to 1919 anyway. What in the 1927 season then was most of the stuff about Cobb and Speaker, was that earlier in the season? I know at the beginning of the year it was, but how much into the season did the controversy over that last, that Ruth's heroics then kind of overshadowed?
Well, Wayne, it was certainly huge leading up and got a lot of mention leading up. And then once the season began, it seemed to go on a back burner. I mean, it might get mentioned a little here or there. Columnist here might take a jab at Cobb or use a funny nickname relating to the scandal for Speaker. But really, it was May when Ruth really started to heat up. He had a bad head cold that he picked up. They barnstormed their last few games in New York. It was extremely cold. Ruth came out of it with a head cold. So he got off to a bad start that year. But by May, he really picked up. And by June was when Gehrig really got hot too. And the two of them had this huge duel going. And you really didn't hear much about the scandal, at least by June, but really by May. It had become an old, outdated story.
Thanks.
I mean, even that was the summer when Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic, and his window, his 5 minutes of fame was almost just that. I mean, he certainly he had a lot of attention, and in the weeks and months that followed, people that did unique things, aviators that did unique things seemed to get attention. But it was pretty hard to knock Ruth and also Ruth and Gehrig's pursuit from the headlines throughout that summer. I mean, when Lindbergh came back to New York, I wrote about this in the book. I mean, he was brought out to Yankee Stadium. I think the promoters knew that there was going to be a big crowd, and Lindbergh wanted to shake hands with Ruth. Unfortunately, they got there after the game was over, and they had to turn around and quickly leave to get to a scheduled appointment. So, but yeah, not even Lindbergh got a lot of attention because of all the attention Ruth and Gehrig were getting.
Wow. Huh.
And it was pretty interesting too, Wayne. People would schedule vacations. If they were in the West, they would schedule vacations to get to St. Louis or Chicago when the Yankees came in. The doctor for the King and Queen of England came over. There was a medical conference he was attending, and apparently he made a side trip to get to Chicago because he wanted to see Babe Ruth hit a home run. That's kind of the level of the enthusiasm that they had that summer. And I didn't mean to diss the Browns or anything there, And Jeff, the background behind you.
1968, Forbes Field. The number on that player is approximately his age.
Yep. That's
when,
great.
When the Braves signed him so he'd get his pension, we were out And we were on a family vacation, stopped at Forest Field, and I was sitting behind one of the dugouts and saw him starting to warm up. And I said, "Dad, that's Satchel Paige warming up." I had to run down to the bullpen to get a picture. I wish I could have got one facing me, but
Still, it's a
That's
great
the best I
picture.
could do.
That's great. That's terrific.
That's what just this jersey is. It's a Satchel Paige jersey.
yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Not authentic. Reproductive. I wish. Wouldn't be wearing it if it were.
I have a friend, Gail Henley, who played a number of years, a bit with the Pirates, but a lot in AAA, and he told of playing with Columbus. And that year they had a little gimmick with a hole in the outfield, and if you could throw a baseball through it, I think, if I remember right, I know it's written up in the Sporting News, I think he won $10,000. And he said every team that came in, their guys were lining up and taking a shot, blanking it off the wall. Nobody got it. Said Miami comes in, and somebody points it out to Satchel, and Satchel walked over and he said, "Throw from here?" And he said, "Yeah." First throw, right through the hole.
Of course.
Amazing. Amazing.
All right, guys. Well, it's almost 8 p.m. East Coast, so last week of the regular season. Our newsletter won't be coming out until mid-October, but I will be sending out updates on speakers through the end of the year, probably by Wednesday.
Oh, that'd be great.
And I have my playoff tickets.
Me too. Yeah.
Did you actually receive them yet on your phone?
I know where I'm sitting. Well, I bought
Oh.
through my plan. I was able to get the one game in each round, but then as a DH, I bought 4 full strips that go all the way through the World Series.
Okay, I got my seat for everything all the way through the World Series. My regular seat to that.
So,
But I mean, it's not doesn't show up on the phone yet because they don't know the exact schedule.
right. The exact dates and stuff are still depending on who seatings and who goes where. So, well, thanks, Dan, for spending our Sunday afternoon for you, evening for the rest of us.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I'll be watching for you guys in the postseason. What a great year for the O's. And
Yeah, I don't think
congratulations.
we'll
Have a
run the
good time.
table this year, but
No.
a round or two, get their feet wet, and then next year, that when Jackson Holiday comes up, I think that's going to be the final
Right.
missing piece.
Oh,
Great. Good
that's going
luck.
to be a great problem to have. Where to put these guys?
Yeah. So I'll take Rookie of the Year and Manager of the Year this year. That's enough for us. So,
I'm hearing a lot of talk like that out of Baltimore, but I'm not giving up. I think they might. I mean, you never know in these
you never
playoffs.
know.
Anything can happen. Yep.
Anything can happen. But I saw them 2 games out of 3 in Houston, and it looked pretty good. But then they split with a team like Cleveland. So
Yeah.
you never know.
But then Kansas City just swept Houston.
I know.
That's amazing.
I'm going Tuesday night.
Might be it. That
we'll
might
see
be
what
the
happens
day.
this last week.
I'm going to both of them Tuesday and Wednesday.
Oh yeah, the Nationals are in town. Yeah. So
Yeah.
depends
Then I got
on
Friday.
weather, but I'll do my best to get to a couple this week. So so have a great week, guys, and be in touch and be on the lookout for upcoming emails about future events and all that good stuff.
Great.
All right.
Okay.
Good night,
you.
everybody.
Take care. Have fun.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan.
Good luck with the book. Thank you.
Thank you. See you guys. Take care.
Yep.
Have fun.
Excellent.